We started a series 2 Sundays ago, and we talked about things that Jesus taught from the Sermon on the Mount. We called it mountain teaching. I'd like to continue those thoughts today. See, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount kind of invites us to take a look kind of at the game film of our lives, to ask what's holding us back, what's weighing us down, what really matters in this life. And this was all pretty cool stuff, mountain teaching taught by the Master. Scientist in the late 1800s named George Stratton wanted to change the way he saw the world and people saw the world. So he did some experiments by creating some lenses that made things to people who wore them look completely upside down. He thought that might change people's perspective of the world and also their behavior if they saw things differently. So he put these lenses on people and everything looked upside down. Since then, scientists have repeated the experiment, and what they found was at first it was pretty unnatural to look at everything upside down. But surprisingly enough, after a few weeks, your mind begins to adjust to these lenses, and your brain allows you to function normally even though things appear upside down. As we've been looking on the Sermon on the Mount, that is what we're really being asked to do. We're being asked to look at the world through a different set of lenses than maybe we're used to. We're being asked to look at the world through a different perspective. And this one is Jesus' perspective. You have been taught this is how your relationships, your commitment, your values go. And Jesus is coming along here and he's turning everything upside down. Yeah. We're finding that what Jesus wants for us is not always what we want for us. And here sometimes Jesus' teaching seems pretty unnatural, maybe even pretty upside down. That's certainly going to be true of what we look at today, because Jesus is going to talk to us about how we respond to difficult people. In the first part of Matthew chapter 5 and verses 21 and 22, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." Remember we said last week, 6 times Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that this was said, and then he quotes something that was universally believed from the Torah, from the Old Testament, something that was a widely held belief. And Jesus never contradicts it. He clarifies it. He gives some deeper meaning. But 6 times Jesus then says, "But I tell you." You've heard this, but I tell you this. Your parents told you this, but I tell you this. The church where you grew up said this, but I tell you this. I know you've been looking through this lens maybe for a long time. I know you've been doing things this way maybe for a long time. But I'm telling you to look through this lens. And maybe it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe even completely upside down. My friends, please notice if you align your lives to what we talk about in the next few minutes, 2 things will happen. Number 1, it will bless your life. Remember how the Sermon on the Mount starts with the words, "Blessed are." Blessed are those. If you do the things Jesus says here, blessed are. Second thing will happen, that you will make a difference in the world. I think everyone, at least that I know, wants to be blessed. And everybody I know wants to have an impact on this life. Early in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. You preserve, you add flavor, you add taste to the world. Show of hands. Anybody ever eat corn on the cob without salt? Some. Wow. How about butter? Oh, there we go. Salt and butter. Yeah, I actually think it's criminal to eat without salt and butter. Maybe even immoral. You can't trust anybody who eats their corn without butter and salt. You know, I actually worry about their salvation. God teaches us to treat people like you are salt. Jesus also says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. When we love people the way Jesus is going to challenge us to, and when people see that, glory goes to the Father. Because that's the kind of love that comes from him. So let's jump to Matthew 5:38. And as we look at this verse, I want you to think of a difficult person in your life. Do that now. As we talk, I want you to think of a difficult person in your life. Now, I want you to have that person in mind, but if they're here, I don't want you to make eye contact. I don't want you to point to them or go. No pointing. Matthew 5:38, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Anybody hear that? Yeah, I've heard that. There was a point where I kind of liked that. You hit me, I hit you back. I won't start it, but if you do, game on. You yell at me, I yell back. You insult me, I insult you back. Here's my favorite. You honk at me, before you're even done honking, I'm honking back. Because eye for an eye, right? There's something in us that says this is fair, this is just. And Jesus is referencing the common Old Testament law and the idea that it's exact retribution. It addresses injustice in such a way that people will be discouraged from hurting others. But it also makes sure that the punishment fits the offense. Eye for an eye. You take my eye, I take yours. And then Jesus comes along with Matthew 5:39. Jesus says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. What? What does that mean? So in the next verses, Jesus gives us 4 different scenarios to show us what it means to live that kind of way. Here's scenario 1. It's the rest of 5:39. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Don't retaliate. Anybody ever have a neighbor with a barking dog? Yeah, that's probably all of us also. One that just barks and barks and barks all night long when you're trying to sleep. And you talk to the neighbor about the dog, but the dog keeps on barking. So here's what you do. Here's the plan. At exactly 2:30 a.m., you call your neighbor from somebody else's phone. And when they answer the phone in their stupor, half awake, you immediately say, woof, 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 woof. Because you'll show them, because yeah, if you bark at me, I'm going to bark back. Literally an eye for an eye, except here it's a bark for a bark. Anybody ever try that? No, I'm surprised. Jesus says, but I tell you this. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, for context, this isn't for an abused spouse, certainly. If you're in that kind of relationship, you leave and get help. If you're a kid at school getting bullied, report it and get some help. But we all have plenty of opportunities to live out, don't retaliate. And the fact that Jesus says right cheek is significant here. Because if someone slaps you on the right cheek and they are right-handed, what do? Well, yeah, they've backhanded you. And in the culture at that time, that was especially offensive and insulting. In fact, there was a harsher penalty for hitting someone with a backhand than slapping someone with a forehand. Jesus says, even if they turn the other cheek, it's not weakness, it's strength. And it may be a little upside down. But if you do this, it'll bless your life and people will notice. And people will see the goodness of God in you. Here's a second scenario Jesus uses to show us how this looks. Scenario number 2 is in Matthew 5:40. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Okay, wait a minute. If somebody sues me, they're suing me, hand over my coat as well. Is this what that's supposed to look like? Yeah. Well, that's different. That's generous. That's kind. In those days, people might have had several shirts, but typically only one coat. And they would also use that coat at night as a blanket. Exodus 22 says that essentially everyone had a right to a coat. So you can't sue someone for their coat. It was their right to own the coat. Jesus is saying here, sometimes following me means letting go of your rights. Now, I'd give my coat to somebody I like, but the person who's suing me, anybody ever been sued? Yeah, I don't think that's what you're going to feel like doing. To give them something? I know a Christian person who was recently sued in a real estate transaction. He sold his house, and the people who bought the house said he covered up wrong things in the house, and they sued him. And he didn't do anything wrong. He was completely blindsided by the lawsuit, and he immediately became angry that someone would unjustly sue him. So he hired a lawyer to defend himself and stand up for his rights. And the lawyer told him, you know what? Why don't you just offer a settlement? And there was no chance of that happening. He just couldn't agree. He couldn't agree to that because he didn't do anything wrong in his mind. So he went to court to defend himself. After all the facts and the testimony were in, the judge dismissed the case against him. And he walked out of the courtroom feeling pretty good about himself. Until about 2 weeks later, when he began to think back on the situation. As this Christian guy looked back, he saw lots of problems. He had never met the couple who sued him before he met them in court. He didn't even remember their names. He asked himself, I wonder if they know Jesus. He didn't know if they went to church. He hoped they knew that he had given his life to Jesus, but how would they know that from court? At one point, he confessed that he didn't respond to the situation in any way that added salt and light. Second guessing himself, he said he should have tried to reach out to them. He should have listened and tried to see things from their perspective. And even though he didn't do anything wrong, the truth is he made quite a bit of money on the sale of the house, quite a bit more than the house was worth. And it would have been a good thing for him to say, you know what, I'm sorry for these things. Let me see if we can help out with some of those repairs. He didn't do anything wrong, but what would have happened if he wouldn't have been so quick to defend himself, to stand up for his rights? He wondered if it would have been possible to add some salt and some light. And the answer is, yeah, he thinks so. He could have been salt and light, but that was too upside down. He didn't for a minute look at things through that lens. Because when someone attacks, you have to defend. Especially when money's involved. Here's the third scenario Jesus gives us to show us what it means to live this way. Scenario 3 is Matthew 5:41. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Here's the problem here. Here is the problem here. It's the word forces. Isn't it? If someone asks me to go a mile, okay, sure. But the minute you force, we get angry and upset because somebody's trying to control us. They're making us do it. And nobody can make me do anything. There was a law back then when a Roman soldier, he could say to a Jew, "Hey Jew, carry my pack a mile." Because they looked down on the Jews as being nothing more than animals. And so a Jewish person didn't have an option. It was part of the deal being under Rome. And so they would pick up the pack and they'd carry it a mile. And once they carried it a mile, they could drop the pack and go home. They didn't have to carry it another mile. Literally, they couldn't be forced to go a second mile. But Jesus says, this soldier, the one who looks down on you and thinks you're nothing more than an animal, the one who's demeaning you, that makes you go a mile, choose to go a second. Well, who does that? Nobody. That's the point. People start to notice when somebody does something like go a second mile and they do it voluntarily. It's different from the way everybody else lives. And you choose kindness. No, even if it isn't deserved, you choose it anyway. So what does it look like in your relationships to live that way? It's especially hard if someone who is the person that has authority over you. People can make your life difficult if it's a boss or a coach or a teacher, somebody with authority over you. Maybe it's somebody out to get you. Ever have people out to get you? What do? Jesus says if they force you to go 1 mile, go 2. If they insult you, say something nice to them. If your spouse criticizes you, compliment. If they blame you, bless them. If your server messes up your order, give them a more generous tip than they would have gotten had it been perfect. You don't think people notice that? You don't think they notice that? If the boss is especially grumpy, pray for your boss and drop a note of encouragement. Second mile. It'll bless your life and it'll make God look good. And here's the last scenario Jesus uses to teach us what this looks like. Scenario 4, Matthew 5:42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. I'm sure you have people like this in your life. They have nothing to give you, but certainly are going to need something from you. How do you respond to that? A businessman had something of value stolen from his store a few years back. Through surveillance video, he found out who the person was that stole the item. Let's call the thief Jake. Store owner knew Jake's family. And as the offended, the store owner had some options. There was that eye for an eye option. Jake could have been arrested and got at least a $1,000 fine, maybe even a year in prison. And that would have been justice. Another option was to vent his anger. He could get his property back and then let everybody know, anybody who would listen, that thief was that kid from that family. You know, that family? That family that lives in that circle? And maybe he could even get some sympathy. Store owner took a third option, kind of really upside down. And he prayed and he asked God for wisdom. And he called Jake and he asked him to come by the store the next day. What happens? Jake doesn't come by, but Dad shows up. He returned the stolen items and apologized for his son's behavior. And the store owner said, I want to see Jake. I want Jake to come by the store. So the next day, Jake comes by the store, and the store owner forgives him. And the only thing he asked Jake to do is to come to church with him the next Sunday. And Jake agreed. And he came. But check this out. The following Sunday, Jake showed up again. And the next Sunday, he showed up with his mom and dad and his two sisters. Now you can ask why, and the answer, I think, is quite simple. Because the store owner put some salt on it. He shone some light. He used the salt and light of love. And here's where it can get really messy for us, folks. See, all four of these scenarios are messy to me, but I'll do it. I won't hit back. And I'll give the coat. I'm not going to want to at first, but I'll give it. And I'll go the second mile if I really should. And I'll give to those who ask, because I've been really blessed. But if my motivation isn't love, then it's all out of self-righteousness, and it doesn't do us any good. Verses 43 to 45. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus says, I tell you to love your enemies. It's got to be based on love. If not, instead, you just have a self-righteous spirit, and you're full of pride. You end up being dismissive to people. I tell you, Jesus says. And he tells us to get back to love. Nothing easy about it, but it begins by understanding how you've been loved by God. And we have to get that. We have to fully understand that. He loves us so much that he sent his son. To die on that tree. For us. Verses 46 to 48 says this, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? Remember, tax collectors weren't the cool people. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? The people without any religion at all, don't they do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And we can't be perfect. But Jesus is perfect enough for all of us. Look, if you just love people who love you, everybody does that. But when you pray for the person who persecutes you, when you pray for the person who curses you, and you bless the person who hates you, that's different. Way, way different. I'd like to close today with a story about Martin Luther King Jr. In 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. was a 20-something-year-old Baptist preacher in Montgomery, Alabama. And one night, his wife and 2-year-old daughter were asleep in the other room, and the phone rang, and he picked it up. And I won't tell you exactly what was said, but there were F words, and there were a lot of N words. and they told him that he had 3 days to get out of town or they were going to kill him and his family. He was angry, he was scared, and he began to pray for those who would hurt him and his family. And at the end of the prayer, he knew 2 things. One was God was with him and would not leave him. Number 2, he knew what his message needed to be. 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking at a rally, and a man runs into the rally and says to him that his house is on fire, and his wife and his 2-year-old daughter may still be in the house. And he runs home, and his house was on fire. By the time he got there, his wife and his daughter were out, and the police and fire people were there, but there was also a mob of black folks that had gathered, many armed with sticks and clubs. They were ready to rise up. They were ready to take a stand. They were ready to back their leader. So with his house burning in the background, he knew what he had to do. And from the front yard of a burning house, he began to preach. Now you may ask, what kind of sermon is he going to preach with his house burning in the background? And he begins, I want you to love your enemies. I want you to love your enemies. Be good to them, love them. Let them know you love them. What we're doing here is right. What we're doing is just, and God is with us. Go home standing on your faith and full of prayer for them. With God's love in your heart, you can't lose. And what was once an angry mob breaks into this hymn of Amazing Grace. And they sing and they cry and they hug and they pray and they peacefully go to their homes. Folks, that is not weak. That is so, so strong. And that's how God changes the world. Amen? He does it through people brave enough to love in this crazy different way. He does it through us. He does it for those who are willing to heed the mountain teaching and be salt and light.